Hello everybody, this video is going to focus on patterns and checking that your pattern is ready and has everything it needs on it before you go to lay and cut on fabric for your garment. So here we have some examples of a pattern. This is the pattern pieces. These are the pattern pieces for a jacket block. And so we have the front and back there, and the sleeve, which is a two-piece sleeve, the facings and the collars there. So there are several things you need to double check that are on your pattern before you are prepared to put it on the fabric to lay and cut. So the first thing, very important, is your labeling. You want to check that you have your name. In this case, we have just the name of the college there, SCFE, Saturday College Further Education. Size 12, professionally patterns would always have their sizes on it. For this college, because we only use the same size the whole time, you are exempt from putting these size on your pattern, but it is good to notice that, or to know that professionally the sizing would be on the patterns. Okay, what you need to have, which is highlighted in darker pencil here, is the name of the garment that you are working on. It can be just your shirt or trouser or whichever, but you need to indicate what garment this pattern belongs to. And then you need to indicate what part of the garment it is. Is it a front? Is it a side front? It is a back piece. So here, this is the front of the jacket block. PP stands for pattern piece. That's there because when you're learning, you might need to still be identifying a pattern piece from a construction or working pattern. So I found this to be helpful for students to actually write on pattern piece when you have piles of paper there, and to try and find which is your pattern piece versus your working pattern. The cutting instructions are very important as well. So cut 2 or cut 1 to the fold, you might see, for example, on the collar here, you have cut 1 to the fold, there. So they're kind of the most common. You might also sometimes see cut 4 if things are being lined with themselves and things, but cut 1 for the starting off and for the basics. It will mainly be between cutting 1 to the fold and cutting 2. Okay, so this indicates if there is no seam allowance, this would be indicating that you are placing this along the edge of the fabric and be cutting to the fold. So there's little arrows there on the pattern to draw your attention to that, so that can be helpful. Okay, so labeling is really important. Notice it's blocked in. Very important to have it all in one place and not spread out over the pattern, so that you're finding your name and the cut instructions down here and which piece it is here. So block it in, make it neat, make it clear, and have all of those pieces of information on it. Really, it gives you the instructions for what you do next. So all of those are very important. It gives you the instructions of what you're cutting and what piece it is. So for the sewing, it will be really important these bits of information are on your pattern piece. Okay. Also, you need straight of grains. First thing you're going to be looking to do when you go to lay your patterns on fabric is how you line these pieces up. So the straight of grain is a line that's on your pattern that has an arrow on it on each end. Okay, I also put an S on that. Some people do that. Sometimes you'll see that that won't be there. There won't be an S, but there will always be arrows at each end. So if there's no arrows on a line, it would indicate something is a kind of construction part of the pattern, like it indicates maybe where a feature is or a pocket or something like that. So if there are arrows at the end of the line, it's basically telling you this line tells you about the direction. So it tells you about the direction or of the grain of the fabric. So the grain of the fabric needs to be lined up parallel to this line on your pattern piece. So each pattern piece should have one of these grain lines on them. When you are starting out, we can assume that the basics in sewing and pattern drafting, you would keep to the center front and the center back line being on the grain of the fabric. So for your patterns, you can get away with, at a minimum, just labeling your center front line or your center back line, and those will work as a straight of grain. Just to note though that that would be an assumption that your pattern straight of grain is, you know, on the center back or the center front line. And as you get more advanced with patterns and garments, that won't always be the case. So as you move on, get in the practice of putting your grain lines on your fabrics. Okay, so that's labeling and that's grain lines. You need to check your seam allowance and hem allowance as well. So you want to check that seam allowance going around the patterns is all nice, it's all there, it's all even, and that there isn't any seam allowance where you have a cut to the fold. Okay, so if you have a cut to the fold and you have seam allowance, you need to remove it. So you need to just double check all your seam allowance. You need to see that all of your lines have been extended through your seam allowances. So any line at all that's happening needs to extend through your seam allowance, so that on the next stage when you're preparing for sewing and you're doing all of your notching and you're snipping with the scissors, that you know exactly where you're snipping. Okay, so that seam allowance needs to be there and the right amount and consistent. Your hem allowance, then double check your hem allowance is correct and that you have hem allowance and you haven't accidentally just put seam allowance everywhere. So the hem allowance there at the bottom, you can see here has been what's called fishtailed. So here is our 4 centimeter hem and it's going at an angle. This is because if you fold this up, if you imagine that that was fabric and you folded it up, you want the fabric to line up along here. Okay, you can see that all these pieces have been fishtailed. So again, if I fold this up, it will sit nicely in line with there. And this one here. So this is 2-piece sleeves. They're kind of funny angles, and so they're a good example of fishtailing because it's kind of dramatic and obvious. Okay, so it will be important that you check your hems. So hems and seams, so we've got labeling, we've had straighter grains, and we've had our seam allowance and hem allowance. So our the last thing really to be sure to check is your notches. So your notches are important on the pattern. So pattern pieces, or when they're in the fabric, they're kind of like jigsaw pieces, and the notches will be absolutely crucial for you to line up your pieces and get them to sew accurately together and fit together. So notches along the edge, you would notch all of your seam allowances, so all these need to be extended. You've got notches in the armhole all along here. Coming down the side seam, we've got our waist notch. Coming down along, we've got our hem notch. So in terms of knowing where you need your notches, that is a little bit tricky at the beginning when you're learning. You can check this list, it will be up on Moodle. It's a pattern checklist, and you can see that this is all a list of notches that should be on your patterns. Okay, each pattern will be different, so some, there may be other types of notches that you might have to do with whatever feature you have. Okay, but that gives you an idea. So you can see, particularly I'll say along the side seam, for example, this is from under the arm, where the angle changes direction. So here we go into the waist, and then we need a notch because we're going to change. This is the female form, so we're going in at the waist. Then at that point, the body changes, goes out towards the hip. That's the widest part, generally speaking. So we have a notch there. Then we would go down, and we'd have a notch at the knee. So general places along the side would always have something at the waist, at the elbow, at the hip, and at the knee. Okay, so you have to learn those as you go, and you can check that list. Now, in terms of the center of the pattern pieces, so that's fine all along the side. You're marking all these notches as we go. In the center, if there's something, a feature or darts or anything, you also have notches. So the notches on the pattern pieces look like an intersecting line. So here we have a dart coming down, and the lines are very long and skinny at the ends of darts. So you can see here particularly. Sometimes it can be hard to determine exactly where the end of that dart is. So drawing an intersecting line really helps us out. Okay, so intersecting there and there. You might think, oh, it's quite obvious where that turns, but get in the habit of drawing your lines there. Because as you go on and as garments get more complex, these kind of practices will really stand to you, and it will make everything more precise, and you'll need that as things get more complicated. Okay, so that covers our patterns. So this if you have your patterns ready to lay, just double check that. Your labeling is all there. Your straighter grains are there. Your seam allowance and your hem allowance is intact. All of your notches have been extended out through the seam allowance and hem allowance, and anything in the center of your pattern pieces has been appropriately marked or notched.